Western philosophy within, let's say, the Mediterranean basin, which is where it began for the Western tradition, starts at about 560 BCE. And we can actually identify a philosopher by name who seems to be, you might say, the person who is an example of the first philosopher. And his name was Thales, Thales. So to say that Thales was the first philosopher, we then have to ask, what made him different from everybody else? Because to identify a person as the first of anything, or sort of as a groundbreaker of some sort, means there must be some characteristics he had that were different from what everybody else had, which sort of marked him as that kind of a person. So what was Thales? What made him different from anyone else, or from the people that are around here? One thing, this did make him different, but sort of starts off the description. One thing that he was greatly interested in is what we would now today call science. He was interested in what philosophers call the nature of physical reality, the nature of what the physical world is like. And so Thales studied the physical world. Remember, at 560 BCE, there were no instruments with which to study the physical world, whether the world of, hey, Casey, whether the world of the heavens, whether the world of the ground and things like that. And so he did the best he could, but there were any number of people who thought that the physical world was interesting, that the physical reality was an interesting thing to study. He was one of them. So that doesn't set him apart, because that places him within, let's say, a tradition of people who thought studying physical reality was an interesting thing. What made him different was sort of the way he did it, and more importantly, his willingness to step outside the box, so to speak. And so what makes him a philosopher is, you might say, is something like that. First of all, he wanted to reason things through. So reasoning, thinking things through as rationally as possible. And the science and the study of logic at that time was very, very poorly developed. But it was pretty easy to determine when you're reasoning well and when you're reasoning poorly at sort of a simple level. And his way of dealing with it was to be systematic and reasoning about the nature of physical reality however he could. So that's sort of the first thing that sort of set him apart. A lot of people who were people who would study physical reality in those days would study it with a thought of saying, well, it's thundering, that means the gods are angry, or it's doing this and that's a reason to think that this is happening, or that is happening. Not as much rationality as sort of more quasi-religious explanations for the physical world. Thales was looking for rational explanations for the physical world. And so that was the one thing that made him different. Using reason, and using reason instead of maybe certain things like faith, belief, etc. Second thing is his willingness to look for explanations of physical phenomena outside the traditionally accepted explanations. Now, the traditionally accepted explanations came from mythology and religion and culture and tradition. All of those kinds of things sort of produced a combination of here's an explanation for why this happens, here's an explanation how this happens, and it's all tied in with tradition and, as I said, religion, mythology, those kinds of things. He was willing to not necessarily turn his back on those explanations, but to say there are other explanations, but you have to be able to think beyond just your tradition, beyond your culture, and think in more objective terms. And so these two things together, the use of reason and the willingness to step outside tradition, step outside the box, and try to study things that way, really made him a philosopher. And you might say, to this day, there's a great deal of philosophy that has these characteristics with it. And as we look down the road here, a lot of the philosophers will come up with, particularly the ones that we end up studying and reading, you will find have a great deal of that as a part of what they are. So Thales was the first person who was known to do that. And the knowledge of Thales comes about through two sources. One, there are some fragments, only a few fragments left of his work, so he wrote a few things. But one person who had read a lot of his stuff was a philosopher who comes later in this tradition, Aristotle. You probably heard of Aristotle, probably hadn't heard of Thales. Aristotle had read, Aristotle was just about the most brilliant person at his time, and he had made it a point to read as much as he could of the history of philosophy, and read as much as he could about the people who preceded him in philosophy to get a sense of where this stream of thought came from and what it was like. So he had read a lot of what Thales had written, and so he could testify to the fact that there was nobody before Thales that we know of. There was no written record of anyone before Thales actually doing anything that we would call philosophical thought. So that's why we put him there. Approximately 560 BCE is somewhere in the middle of his of when he was working. So that's where philosophy begins, at least in the Western tradition. And as we move on here, we won't have to go too far to get to the next sort of the next date that I want to put up here. And this will be 400. Again, BCE. Used to be called BC, before Christ. Now, you might say secular historians tend to use the term BCE, before Common Era, and CE, after the AD, we should be AD, as Common Era. So sort of a secular way of categorizing time. But the numbers are the same. Yeah?
There's 400?
Huh?
Is that 400? I can't see so well.
It is a 400,
Okay.
but it's written in code. I went to art school that way. Should I explain that? It seems sort of preposterous now, as you see what I've done here. But I did. I went to one of the most prestigious and expensive art schools in the country. It's now called the Art Center College of Design in, I think it's in Pasadena. It was in West LA at the time when I went in the early 70s. But I was a photography major, so you don't have to do anything like this. And you can still be a photography major. All you have to do is get your hands ruined with chemicals. And I did. So let's go. I was 400. Should I spell it out like on your checkbook and pay the order out? F-O-U-R-H. This class will last a long time. And we don't want that. The next person who comes along is a person you're going to get to know probably better than anyone in this class other than me, and you'll wish you knew him better than me. It's Socrates. Socrates is also a person I'm going to identify, it says ink left, I'm going to identify as the invisible ink will stand us in good stead. So that's one I'm going to have to go raiding another room. Ah, yes. Is what I'll call a revolutionary or a game changer in philosophy. I'll identify several of them as we go along. Socrates is the first one who I wish to identify in that manner. He changed what philosophy did. I mentioned before that Thales studied the physical world, the nature of physical reality, the heavens and the ground and animals and stuff like that. And most of the philosophers that followed him until we get to Socrates did the same thing. In fact, they are often called by one sort of a name. They're called pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic just means before Socrates. And that probably gives you a hint at how important Socrates is in our estimation in the world of the history of philosophy, that everything before Socrates was just, a bunch of crap. And we just go, oh, those are the pre-Socratics. Now, some of them are really good philosophers. Leucippus was one who was maybe the first person to think of the atomic theory of matter. That's pretty good for somebody who doesn't have a microscope or anything like that. So there were some good people, but most of them, like Thales, studied the nature of physical reality. Socrates comes along and says, who cares? He was a great philosopher, you will find out. But his idea, the nature of reality we ought to study is human reality. We ought to study the nature of human experience, what it is to be a human being, what it is to understand the contents of consciousness and stuff like that. For him, he could care less about the physical world. He only wanted to know about the conscious world, the world that we live. And so he changed philosophy forever, because most philosophy followed Socrates. Most other people who wanted to continue studying the scientific version of reality ended up being seen as scientists, seen as physicists or biologists or something like that. And philosophers went on looking at what they wanted to look at. So Socrates was a great game changer, and so he changed the face of philosophy forever. Now, the very fact that the pre-Socratics all studied the physical world is going to come out to be a very important thing during his trial. So I'll save that for then. But just keep this in your memory, because it will then suddenly make a little more sense to you once we talk about the charges in the trial. But for right now, Socrates changes everything, studying of human existence and the studying of human life, including how to live a good life, how to take responsibility for the kind of life you lead. These are all the kinds of things that Socrates wrote about. There's a nice little progression here. Socrates was a teacher of Plato. Plato was a teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle was a teacher of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was just a kid. I guess he was called Alexander the Kid, wasn't he? But he was the son of Philip of Macedon up in the northern part of what's called Macedonia now, the northern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula up there. And Aristotle decided to, after he had enough of it as a student in Plato's school, went back home to Macedon, ended up tutoring Alexander the Great, and so I guess that's a cute little story. Before we leave this era of philosophy, I want to talk about a couple of other things. One thing, this is called the ancient era. There will be 3 subdivisions, chronological subdivisions within philosophy. Ancient will be the first one, obviously, the oldest one. And what I'm going to try to identify in each of these are, let's say, 2 dominant themes that philosophy listened to, or that for philosophy it was an important thing. So, the dominant themes in ancient philosophy, particularly ancient philosophy post-Socrates, the dominant themes were the use of individual reason, you'll find this both implicitly and explicitly in Socrates. When you read Plato and see how Socrates acts, I mean, he is always about, think this through, think it for yourself. You're not thinking well, you are thinking well, whatever it is. Individual reason was thought to be one of the most important things that both human beings can engage in and that philosophy can help teach. And so that's an important thing, individual reason. The second thing, again, this is sort of post-Socratic, has to do with, let's say, self-understanding. For Socrates, it isn't just, in fact, it wasn't at all important for Socrates to understand you. It was important for you to understand you. Self-understanding was the key to thinking philosophically as an individual. It's not that philosophers come up with great theories about human nature. Some have come up with some pretty poor ones as well. But for Socrates and for most of the ancient world, it wasn't coming up with a theory about how human nature is. It's giving you the tools and convincing you that you have the obligation to understand yourself and figure out yourself on the terms of, let's say, reason. Don't just sort of pull it out of your ass. But at the same time, you have this responsibility. You can't just live, as he says at the end of his trial. You just can't live an unexamined life. To live an unexamined life is not living. It's barely, just barely existing as an animal. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. And at the very end of his trial, when he decided it was better not to live than to conform to what Greece wanted him to do, he made that point. No matter what you do, if you don't think it through for yourself, you're the only one who can truly understand yourself. So it's an obligation you have. So these 2 things work together. Individual reason is the tool, self-understanding is the goal, and that was a lot of what the ancient world was about. And we move farther into the ancient world, and we'll get to maybe in the CE era, Stoicism. You'll see a video on Seneca, one of the great Stoics, who he was around 50 or 75 CE. So, and he was from Rome as well. But the same sort of thing was happening there. He and Epictetus and even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who came at the very end of the time of ancient philosophy, were all Stoics. And Stoicism is all about thinking about your own obligation to yourself, your own obligation to your world, and making yourself the best person you can be. So it's all about this. So the ancient world, for a long amount of time, was all about these two topics. But then things changed. They always do. Somewhere around, again, this is around approximately 300 CE, things changed. And I'm going to put the name of a philosopher up there who I'll sort of name as a game changer at this junction. And his name was Augustine. Augustine is not the only, there's a difference in game changing here between Socrates and Augustine. Let me just give you a little idea of what it is. Socrates was alone. There is nobody like him. He changed philosophy single-handedly. Augustine is, let's say, a member of a group, some of whom didn't know each other, a group of people who wanted to effect a change in the way philosophy operated. He's probably the most prominent of this group of philosophers, many of them were very obscure, who entered in or ushered in what could be called the medieval era. There are some great philosophers in the medieval era, and we're putting Augustine at the beginning. Augustine ended up also becoming a bishop in the Christian church. He was maybe the first great philosopher from Africa in the Western tradition. He was from North Africa and is eventually returned to North Africa and became a bishop in an area of land there. But before he did that, he was a very good philosopher. He was a good philosopher all his life. I mean, not that the church squeezed it out of him or anything like that. He was a great philosopher. He was an excellent philosopher. But in his earlier years, he was much sort of more free and thinking in wide-ranging ways before he finally decided, okay, the Christian church is got all the answers, and so I'm going to now become someone who explains why the Christian church has all the answers. And this is a little hint as to what is in the medieval era. In the medieval era, the two major characteristics of philosophy are, first of all, subservience, subservient to religion, and I'll just put the word authority. I'll explain what both of them mean. The first one is probably easy to understand. To be subservient to something means that you consider yourself inferior to it. You place yourself beneath it. In the ancient time, before medieval time, and particularly with Socrates, the view was that philosophy was independent of everything. And that's one of the things that made someone like Thales, and even more so Socrates, a pain in the ass for everybody. Because he didn't, neither of them did, have any desire to just conform to what everybody else thought, to accept the restrictions that society placed on thought and belief and ideas and those kinds of things, that you think for yourself, and philosophy has to have an independent status so it doesn't get co-opted by religion or culture or tradition or politics or anything like that. So that was one of the points of pride, and you'll see that in Socrates a lot. You'll see that as he talks, particularly in his trial, defending himself against the charges. You'll see that. Well, with Augustine, it's almost reversed completely. Augustine's view, the view of most in the medieval time, was that the job of philosophy was not to question anything about religion, but it was to serve religion. It is to accept the truths of religion and then offer reasons why the truths of religion are true. So that the job of philosophy was not at all to be some sort of an independent, maybe critical function to say, well, does this make sense? Is this really true, etc. But to submerge those questioning aspects of it to being nothing more than, you might say, an apologist is a term that's used today, an apologist for religion. So this is extraordinarily different from the time of Socrates. Here we are just, 700, 800 years after Socrates, and philosophy has changed dramatically. The idea of authority is a larger view that one other job that philosophy has to do is to explain why authority over people is justified. And typically it's authority underwritten by the church, but it's authority of a king, authority of a noble, authority of a general, of a despot, doesn't matter what. At this time, ideas of something called the divine right of kings were starting to be formulated. And it was the job of philosophy to explain why, if the king orders, then it must be the will of God that he orders, because God is omnipotent, and God can smite this king down. But God has not chosen to smite the king down. Therefore, God approves what the king is ordering. Therefore, you must yourself obey what the king orders. So there's the divine right of kings and one ugly long sentence. So the idea that authority was there because God wills it, or God permits it, or else God would have gotten rid of it, is something that also philosophy was expected to heal to and to accept. There are a couple of good people in the history of philosophy here in medieval time, and I'll put an end to it, and then let's put Aquinas in here. St. Thomas Aquinas, put him around 1250, something like that. This is again an approximation, 1270, I think, but it doesn't matter. Just generally where he is on the timeline is there. And we have pretty close to this time, we have the beginning of Islam as a philosophical movement. Obviously the religion of Islam, and then the philosophers. When I was teaching quite a few years ago, I taught at Baker University in Baldwin City. I was sort of there. They had one person, and I was the second philosopher there. And I taught a 2-semester course on the history of political philosophy. And one of the interesting books I taught was a book by an Islamic philosopher from this time, from a little after Aquinas, called Al-Farabi. And Al-Farabi was just a great political philosopher, just sort of almost unknown except within the Islamic world. It was a privilege to read and teach him. So there were a lot of good philosophers coming out of several traditions. The Jewish tradition was still alive and kicking, but you can see that nearly all the traditions within the medieval era were essentially traditions based on some sort of religious institution. Whether it's Christian, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Islamic, within the Western world, those were the 3 big dogs that hunted, and they hunted philosophers for lunch. Is it the sound of angels?
Oh my gosh.
Yes, the heavenly choir is now. Yes. You need to make your cell phone subservient to philosophy.
No.
So anyway, back to the medieval time. So I won't say too much more about it because it was, sometimes it's called the Dark Ages. I don't really want to say that. But the medieval era was a time in which philosophy lost a lot, just lost a lot of its power. Now, Aquinas was a great philosopher. He's one of the great thinkers in the history of the world, I think. I find Aquinas to be an extraordinary thinker. But his thought was all based upon the presupposition that the Christian religion was true, and therefore, let me explain why. So he, if anything, he was sort of the uber philosopher of the medieval time, that he did it better than anybody else. And he did. He was a great, great philosopher. And also a great big philosopher. He's about 300 pounds. So there's not just a great philosopher and a great big philosopher. So let's bring the medieval period to an end. Let's put one more person in there. I think we need to, even though his name is long, let's put him in there. At about 1500, Machiavelli. Pretty important. I put down the names at least of the people we're going to read, I guess. So, Machiavelli comes at the very end of the medieval period when a lot of questions, a lot of challenges to the presuppositions of medieval philosophy are being made. But within Machiavelli, you see him sort of straddling a fence between accepting the view of authority that was traditional, accepting the view of the church that was traditional, but still offering some very pertinent challenges within what he was writing. It's a his book, The Prince, is really, it's a notorious book, and I think it's a very, very interesting book to read, shocking to some people, and maybe even today it's a shocking book. I'm no longer shocked because I've taught it for so many years, but I find that people who are not used to having something like this proposed philosophically find it rather curious. So let's get out of the medieval period, and at about 1600, we'll start the last period. It is called modern nowadays. It's hard to think that something at 1600 is thought of as modern, but the modern era is what we're in now, and there is some question, at least there's some debate about whether the modern era ended sometime in the 20th century and something like either the postmodern era or something else began there. I'm sort of not going to make it too complicated. I think that the less complicated, the better. I think there are enough modernists around to still have a forum when the book comes up. So we'll say the modern era starts about 1600. And the person, one of the persons most thought of as being at the beginning of the modern era is Descartes. And he himself likewise will be a great revolutionary. We'll be reading him, of course. He, as well as Machiavelli, but maybe somewhat less so than Machiavelli, does sort of straddle these two eras and somewhat uncomfortable. Descartes was a very religious person. He bought into Christianity. He was a lifelong Christian to the day he died. He believed he was a faithful Catholic. At the same time, there was a contract out on him, and he never lived in a Catholic country. He never lived in a country where the Catholic Church was powerful because he knew that he wouldn't live very long. His views on religion, though he claimed himself to be a Christian, were, for the institution of Christianity at the time, very, very innovative, shall we say. They would probably call it more heretical. He believed that the institution of Christianity had left Christ behind, had left God and the ideals of Christianity behind, and was so intent upon coercing belief and coercing people into a particular mold that he found that to be quite un-Christian. And he had some ideas about the use of reason within the church and within religion that were very, very unpopular with the authorities. So he was there very much within within a belief structure that was representative of the powers of the medieval time. But he was a modern person. He was a scientist. He was a great scientist in his time. He was one of the greatest scientists. I'll talk about Descartes later. We'll talk about the things he did in science. I'll just mention one thing, that if you, in math, have ever had to study analytic geometry, you can blame or thank Descartes for that, since he invented analytic geometry. And the XY coordinates on a graph, that's all Descartes. But the word Cartesian, which you may hear from time to time in other contexts, other than philosophical, the word Cartesian means from Descartes, of Descartes, by Descartes, of the people, by the, of the Descartes, by the Descartes, for the Descartes, shall not perish from the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem. Yes?
You said Descartes believed that the church had left Christ and was coercing people to serve its own purpose.
Yeah. And in fact, it had more to do with forcing people into a particular mold of belief, where Descartes believed that belief, if it's to be genuine, must be spontaneous, or at least cannot be used with threats and things like that. We'll talk a little bit when we get to Descartes about the Inquisition, because obviously he's talking in part about the various inquisitions that the church put on. But for right now, Descartes does sort of bestride both worlds, wanting to be a good Christian and wanting to not betray what he believes is important, both about his faith and about the world of thought, the world of philosophy, in which he was an outstanding philosopher. So Descartes is a big, important person. In that same era, though, there were other great people. There's a man whose work is still esteemed today, an Englishman, Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes, very different from Descartes. They had very different views on philosophy, the world, etc. Hobbes was not a believer. Hobbes was called a materialist. We'll talk about materialism when we talk about Descartes, as sort of a preface to Descartes. Materialist believes that the only reality is physical. And so Hobbes and Descartes had very, very different views on lots of things, but they respected one another. And he was as much an important philosopher at the beginning of the modern era as was Descartes. Descartes has been more influential and probably got more people pissed off at him than anyone. So we'll say that makes you outstanding. The more people that hate you, the more outstanding you are, I guess. I don't know. So on with the modern era. What's in the modern era? One thing that's in the modern era is a return to something that was in the ancient era, and that is a return to individual reason. In the medieval time, individual reason, the use of reason, and thinking that reason was something you can depend upon, was often demonized by both religious philosophers and religion itself as a temptation, that the devil is tempting you through reason to overthrow your faith and things like that. So the whole thought was that individual reason has to be put aside, and what you must do is depend upon the good work of the church to tell you what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, what's real and what's spurious. And so the use of individual reason was thought to inevitably lead you into error, and error in the medieval times means lead you into the road to perdition. And so individual reason was thought to be absolutely something that people need to be weaned away from. And Descartes brings it back, among other people too, not only Descartes, but Descartes brings it back because he believed not only that individual reason is the way forward in the scientific world, which is what he was an important member of. He thinks individual reason has a central role to play in the religious world. This made him very, very much unpopular with the religious authority. But he argued for it and he substantiated, and when we do the Descartes section, which comes up at the end of the semester, we talk about his view of reason and religion, and I think it's a pretty refreshing view myself. So individual reason has come back, has been resuscitated. And how do I state this? I state it as, and modern philosophy is also anti-authoritarian. Now, it's not that authority was resisted. It was that arbitrary authority that cannot be substantiated must be resisted. It's not that all authority is contaminated. It's merely that if authority cannot defend itself and explain why it has this right to issue these orders to you, force you to do this, etc., then in the absence of any kind of a rational explanation as to why this authority is being wielded over you, then that authority has no legitimation. It's not a legitimate thing. So the anti-authoritarian parts you can probably already have a guess about, as I've talked about Descartes, but there are lots of other people as well. I mentioned the divine right of kings, and there was a man in the 17th century, right around the turn of the modern time, Sir Robert Filmer. And Sir Robert Filmer wrote a very long book, underwritten by the royal family of England, of course, saying why the divine right of kings was a good doctrine, and arguing for the divine right of kings as a reflection of God's will on the secular world, and so we all should obey the king that's paying for the publication of this book. So, a rather convenient thing. Coming after that, John Locke, he wrote this around 1670, wrote the first of his two treatises on government. John Locke's one of the great philosophers. I'm sorry we're not reading John Locke, but I couldn't put two people, Locke and Descartes, were nudged up next to one another. Of course, Machiavelli and Descartes are too, but I wanted to do Machiavelli. I'll tell you when we get to Machiavelli why I wanted to do Machiavelli. It had to do with the election year, because Machiavelli's book is all about should we have, essentially, should we have moral leaders? I mean, is personal morality a requirement or a detriment for political leaders? It's a nice question. We'll see how Machiavelli answers it. You can answer it on your own. Locke's view was that the divine right of kings was outmoded, it needed to be put aside. He wrote the first treatise on government as a way of absolutely rationally untangling and destroying Filmer's argument for the divine right of kings. Then he wrote a second treatise in government, much more popular and much more famous one. That if I were to have you read, I would have you read the second one, trying to show how, with the use of individual reason, we ourselves can have authority over our own lives. It was sort of a, you might say, one of the founding documents of democracy, of, let's say, Western democracy after the Grecian experiment there, the Athenian experiment, came from John Locke. And we put Locke out there. He deserved, you know, he could get a little, he's a John Locke. And he died 1704, so we'll put him here at 1700. And his great book, the Second Treatise on Government, explains how and why we as rational individuals have both the right and the obligation to rule ourselves. So it was quite a great book, and if you read that, you'll find it rather interesting as you then follow it and read maybe the Declaration of Independence. In particular, the Declaration shows that if Jefferson had been my student, I would have flunked him, because he plagiarized so much from John Locke. You know, I put it into Turnitin.com, and 50% plagiarized from Locke. I mean, the guy would have flunked. So Jefferson's lucky it was not in his class. So the important thing is that Jefferson had read John Locke, understood what Locke was talking about, and understood how it applied to what they hoped would be the American Revolution, what turned out to be the American Revolution, and an attempt at self-government after quite a few decades of government by the British. So let's move on through here. I don't think I want to name too many other people there because they're really sort of irrelevant to the course since we're not reading. I wouldn't mind if we got up here though, because there is a guy I wish we could read. This is going to be around 1950. He died in 1953, I think. And his name is Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein from Austria. And he will be one of the great revolutionaries as well, a great game changer in philosophy. And one of the reasons I really like to keep it at 3 eras, because I do think that we're still grappling with what Wittgenstein had to write. Wittgenstein was just an extraordinary person. One of the things that he did was that he looked at the history of philosophy, and he recognized that throughout the history of philosophy, there have been moments, there have been times in which philosophical ideas and philosophical theories have been based upon assumptions that people would say, well, everybody knows this is true, so we say that and move on. And he said, let's look at those assumptions to see if the assumptions in fact are true. Let's do some scrutiny of the unexamined assumptions in the history of philosophy. And when he did his scrutiny, he was pretty appalled at how sloppy sometimes people have been in their eagerness to say, well, let's get to this conclusion. They would unfortunately sort of screw the pooch. And the result being that Wittgenstein thought it was one of his duties was to, if not overturn the history of philosophy. He didn't really want to do that. But he wanted it to be rewritten. He wanted things to, we need to wipe some stuff out and start fresh with the things that we now know have been in error in the past. So he made a lot of enemies, but he was so profound and so also somewhat mysterious. He was a very, very interesting person who has the influence of Wittgenstein today can't be underestimated. Almost every philosopher, no matter where they teach or what they do or what they think about, has Wittgenstein sort of over their shoulder nagging them about what are they doing, etc. Wittgenstein was a towering person. And it's just a wonderful, some wonderful stories connected with Wittgenstein. I'll tell you a couple of them. One is relevant to this class, and one is just something that seems sort of funny. I'll do the sort of the funny one first, because this also has a little Wittgenstein began to believe that all the arguments for objective moral standards or objective epistemological standards, that there is any objective truth in the world, he's begun to think that those arguments were just mistaken, that there is nothing objective. Everything is something of a sort of a relative to your standpoint, and the world, you know, is the best you can do. And he had, as a teacher, he was a great teacher at Cambridge. As a teacher, he had a very notorious way of describing this relativism, that, you know, it's in some sense an individual truth rather than a universal truth. And his famous saying is, "You can't shit higher than your ass." Okay, I'm not asking if we have a demonstration here, but one thing I found was funny was last semester, teaching a class, intro class at 12 o'clock, I told this Wittgenstein story, and a month and a half later, one of the students in the class who says that she's in a band called Butt Vomit, also says that she wrote and the band performs a song called Higher Than Your Ass. As a tribute to Wittgenstein, you can't shit higher than your ass. So I think Wittgenstein would really like that Butt Vomit as singing a song about relativism. You can't shit higher than your ass. Yes?
So he was a cultural relativist also.
Yeah, well, not as much cultural. I mean, there are different kinds of, cultural relativism is a much more, I would say, much more tainted version of relativism. It's much more easy to refute than, let's say, some sort of a general relativism.
What about moral relativism?
Well, yeah, he's pretty much a moral relativist as well, but he didn't deal much in morality. He didn't have much at all to say about morality. He had much more to say about the nature of knowledge and the nature of reality. And he just thought that any pretense at knowing objectively what's in the world is just pretense, and that's all it is. He wasn't much for morality. It just wasn't his bag. It just wasn't his cup of tea. Not that he was immoral. Philosophically, he found it uninteresting. But he did like the other stuff. So, whether or not you can shit higher than your ass, at least we know what Wittgenstein has to say. So let me tell you, I don't think I've told you this story. My story about Wittgenstein has to do with one of his students. I don't think I told you about her. Philippa Foot. Let's talk about Foot. It's funny hearing me with my supposedly broken toes talking about Foot, but okay. When I was a grad student at KU, Philippa Foot, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, came to KU as a visiting professor one semester. And I was, among all the grad students there, apparently, the only one interested in art and music and those kinds of cultural things. And I really am. That's sort of my second life is that kind of thing. And so she wanted to go to the Nelson Atkins upon occasion because she loved art. She wanted especially to go to the Chinese and Japanese collection, one of the greatest in the world there. And so I was happy to take her there. And so we got along real well. And as a grad student, she was, you know, at least pretended to be interested in what my research was doing. And so we would talk about it occasionally. I remember this one time, we were talking about environmental ethics, which is something that was a great interest of mine. And so she had only heard a little bit about environmental ethics, so she said, okay, tell me some of the arguments for environmental ethics. Why should the environment, why should nature have any kind of moral status independent of anything else? So, gave me a chance to show off, right? I'll strut my stuff and get a nice letter of recommendation from one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, and who knows where I'll end up. Well, you can see how much I impressed her. Okay, no. So we were talking about it. I was trying to show off and show her how much I knew about this. And she stopped me cold. She said, no, stop. You're going too fast. So I took my hand off her thigh. That's not the joke. I just aside. She said, stop, you're going too fast. You're trying to get to the conclusion before your premises are strong enough to support it. And then she added the following thing. She said, Wittgenstein always told us that philosophy is that race in which the victor is the one who goes slowest. And I understood what she meant as concerned me. And now I understand what he meant concerning philosophy. And that's one of the reasons we go slowly. One of the reasons I only give you a few pages to read. I want us to sort of be Wittgensteinian in the sense that I want us to go slowly and carefully through the material. Not feel as if we want to race through and have an arbitrary page count as our goal, rather than understanding as our goal. And so I guess I'm somewhat Wittgensteinian in that way as well. I'm not as much a relativist as Wittgenstein. I can't buy into it. I mean, I like his can't shit higher than your ass. I think that's a cool saying, but I'm not a relativist at his level of relativism. But Wittgenstein is one of the most important philosophers in history. Certainly the most prominent philosopher of the 20th century, and there's no one in the 21st century that I know of who has come anywhere close to him. There's some good philosophers alive today. One of the reasons I assigned that video, Examine Life, is to give you a chance to see who some of the philosophers today are, what they think, who they are, what their interests are, and there's some great people in that. Peter Singer, Cornel West, Martha Nussbaum. These are great. Those are all three American philosophers. Some other philosophers from other places as well that are there. And these are people who are alive and kicking and still doing great work. And so I wanted you to, as I put this timeline out here, you might think, wow, all there is to philosophy is a bunch of old dead geezers from there. And there are a lot of, in fact, not even geezers and geezettes, a lot of young people who are doing great work. I'll introduce you to David Chalmers when we get to the book on Descartes, because he is a great young mind today that's just making waves. And actually, I have a video of him coming up later. It's a video of him singing. His singing is not quite as good as his philosophy, I gotta tell you, but still. So I want you to be aware that philosophy is an ongoing process. Maybe that's why I have the arrow still moving at the end of the board there. There still are things that are happening in philosophy, so I want you to know of that. So that's going to be our little timeline. Doesn't mean that we're over for the day, because we got plenty of time left, and you paid for a full class. I would hate to cheat you. You know, it would go against my conscience if I would think, my God, I stole from those people. I stole money out of their pockets, because they paid for an hour and 15 minutes. I only gave them 55. I mean, it would be shameful. Now, I may have done some shameful things in my life, and I ain't going to do that. So I'm going to go over here, and you can all sort of stretch your necks and not. Wow, Mr. Brown's here. Did you? Yes. What a wonderful thing. We didn't talk badly about it, did we? We didn't. Did we? What I want to talk about now are let's say the subject matter of philosophy. There's often thought of as four major subdivisions within philosophy that we study. So I'll look at them. You'll look at them. I'll put them on the board. Epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. There are lots of things concerning knowledge that epistemologists look at. There can be just general epistemology, like how do we know what is it possible to know? What's the process of knowledge? What are the criteria for saying something is something we know rather than something we guess at? And there can be other kinds of epistemology. When I'm teaching philosophy of religion, near the beginning of the class, I talk about what's called a religious epistemology. If there are truths in religion, how do we come across them? How do we know them to be true? And we think of things like revelation, of perhaps the authority of a tradition, etc., as well as reason and other things. So you can have moral epistemologists. Another thing, how do we know about the truths of morality? How do we know about the truths of right and wrong? If we're going to say something, it's true that it's wrong to kill people for pleasure. Where does the knowledge of that truth come from? And so epistemology is a really interesting field. We will talk a lot more. I will spend far more time on epistemology during the Descartes lesson, or at the beginning of it, because Descartes' meditations start off, at least, fundamentally as meditations on the nature of knowledge, the nature of epistemology. And so I'll spend a lot more time with that. Just to let you know what it is maybe a good starting point. there is a part of philosophy that's often allied with it, and for good reason, and that is metaphysics. It's a separate category. It's the study of reality, what's real. And within, the world of metaphysics, we can think of, the question, the word metaphysics has in it a hint of some of the questions that come up. Meta meaning sort of beyond or more profound than, or in a deeper level than. Physics sort of meaning the physical world. So it really almost presupposes a question. Is the physical world the only reality? In other words, is materialism, which is the claim that only the physical is real. Is the physical world the only reality? Or is there some other reality in addition to the physical? Or is the physical world an illusion and all reality is non-physical? So the whole question about, is there something other than the physical world that we all seem to come in contact with and we all seem to have pretty close access to? Here it is. Okay, here the physical world. So at least I think it is. So that we all have pretty close access to the physical world, and we seem to have an idea that it's real. But is there something else that's real? Is there something that the physical world is different from the physical world that's real? Well, within metaphysics, you can say that, one subdivision of this whole thing might be philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion is sort of based upon the view that there's a God, or at least it takes the claim that there is a God seriously. If there is a God, and we think of gods in the terms of the transcendental, sublime, spirit being, then that sort of is saying, yeah, there is something other than the physical world. So philosophy of religion is one sort of subdivision within metaphysics that sort of pursues that part of the metaphysical question. Is there a God? And if there is a God, does religion reflect that God, or is religion sort of irrelevant to the existence of God? That's going to be a little subcategory that we're going to be undertaking as we move in through Plato. Yeah.
When talking about metaphysics and kind of reality, and I'll kind of guess more like along the line of materialism, does the forces that control the physical world, is that taken into account, or is that something like a separate subdivision?
I think it would depend really on if you wish to take the forces, like say the force of gravity, some sort of thing like that, strong atomic force, whatever it could be, whether they are forces or whether they are descriptions of how reality behaves in rather consistent ways is a different thing. If they are forces and they act upon the physical world, but they are not of themselves physical, then you'd have to say that then that would show that there probably is something non-physical that exists in the world of reality. If, however, these forces are merely ways human beings have of describing regularities within the physical world, then they're merely descriptions, and they're descriptions of the physical world. And so you really wouldn't have to say that they have their own separate reality. The philosopher David Hume, who came around he died 1774, I think. Philosopher David Hume had the view that certain things that we think of as existing, like cause and effect, he says they don't really exist independent. What you have is cause and effect, that you have objects acting here, objects reacting later. But he says the test is, can you find cause, just that thing, that entity, whatever it is, separate from any objects it's acting upon? Let's examine cause. Okay, there it is. Well, you can't examine cause. You can't examine cause alone. You can only examine cause. No, not much of an example, but hell, I only got 2 markers in my hands. But that sort of, you couldn't, if one marker caused the other to do a little pinwheel, so you say, okay, let's take those markers away and let's look at cause. You said cause is there, let's find it. It ain't there. So the view of Hume was that we have to give up these little fictional descriptions we have of things existing when we can't observe them. Can't observe them. He was obviously not, he was curious, if you can't observe them, then too bad. So, there's epistemology and metaphysics, and one thing you'll also find out that as we look at these two together, as we always do, or normally do, you'll find out that the questions of metaphysics and the questions of epistemology seem to interact with one another. If you're going to ask, what's real, you're going to also ask, well, how do we know anything? Which means, if we can make the claim that something is real, then we must have some sort of knowledge of it. And so these two have to work together. The third category is called value theory. And value theory is very different from metaphysics and epistemology in that it studies the concept of values, first of all. What makes something so meaningful to valuers? We think of human beings probably as the main valuers, at least on this planet. What makes something so meaningful to human beings that they value it? To value it means you sacrifice for it, you want to enhance it, you want to protect it, you want to do lots of things for it. So how do we understand that? Because it's not about the physical world. It's not about even about knowledge per se. It's about how we go about the process of valuing. And within value theory, you can probably figure out the categories, pretty easy to find out. Ethics is probably the most important one. Ethics is, having to do pretty much with, human interaction with one another, how we ought to treat one another, are there certain kinds of ways that are inconsistent ethically with treating people? Are there ways that are consistent? A lot of philosophers have thought about those things. Aesthetics is one of my favorite fields because I'm sort of an art, music, culture hog. And so actually, probably the first area in philosophy that really interested me. Because when I first went to college, I was a music major. In fact, maybe I should tell you this. We got time, yeah. It took me 26 years to get my bachelor's degree. From when I first went to school to when I finally got my bachelor's degree. 26 years. Now, I wasn't a professional student. I didn't go to school for 26 straight years. But it took me from when I first went to school, immature, wise-ass, and flunked out after 2 years. Just full disclosure here. I flunked out after 2 years, went in the Air Force, did those kinds of things, got married or became a father, not necessarily in that order, and had responsibilities which I fulfilled, but eventually became a philosopher and got a degree in philosophy and then went on to graduate school as well. So it took me 26 years to do that. So I'm merely saying that not to humiliate myself. I do that real well in other ways. I do it mainly to encourage those of you who maybe have not been in school for a while or coming back after a disappointing first try. I had a disastrous first try. I flunked out. My parents got that letter from the dean, that sumbitch ain't coming back. That's because I went to school in Kentucky. That's the way the deans write their letters. Actually, they did say that sumbitch ain't coming back. Your son has failed to distinguish himself at an adequate level for continued enrollment at our university.
So yeah, that's
Keep his ass home. So, my ass stayed home and went in the Air Force. So it took me 26 years, but through that time, I was always interested in, I was a music major, so I was always interested in arts and those kinds of things. And so eventually, as a music major, found out that I didn't quite really have the chops, but I had the intellectual chops to try to think about these issues, and so I found that to be interesting. I still love aesthetics. Things are wonderful. And there's one other area of value theory you might find preposterous as having to do with values. Political philosophy. I think political philosophy is great. It's one of the things I concentrated on when I was in grad school, and I love reading political philosophy, probably as much as any other philosophy. But political philosophy is all sort of about, let's say, notions of justice and notions of equality, and how can we construct a political system, or how can we adjust a political system so that these supreme values, justice or equality or whatever other supreme value you think needs to be there, how can these supreme values actually take place in the real world. The real world is a political world, but the political world isn't, at least, let's say, philosophically speaking, it's not just sort of horse trading. It is having your eye on a particular prize that you're trying to create. So, value theory, interesting stuff. And finally, we have logic. GIC, for those who can't read my code. Logic is sort of the technique of philosophy. Philosophy is all about reasoning, but when it comes right down to it, we can think about all of this stuff in whatever abstract way, but if we want to make a claim about it, if we want to say this is what's true, this is the way things are, this is why this is right or that's wrong, we have to argue. We have to make an argument, which means we have to obey the laws of logic. And the laws of logic are extremely demanding, and it's necessary that everyone who is a philosopher must know logic, which means you're all going to learn a little bit of it before you have a chance to withdraw. And everybody who does philosophy needs to have logic, because everything we do in philosophy ends up being something we reason through. You'll find this when we get to Plato, we start looking at how Socrates talks. Socrates holds Euthyphro's feet to the fire, logically speaking. You can't get away with this crap around me, pal, kind of thing. And so he said it in a much nicer way. But he said it in Greek, so who knows, maybe he did say that. So logic is the fourth segment, this fourth subject area within philosophy. So we're just about at the end, but I'm going to give you a reading assignment. Let me also remind you that there is no class on Monday. Monday is Martin Luther King Day. We're going to be doing some service in honor of, or in memory of the great work that Dr. King did. I think I'll probably be cooking for people who need food. I like to cook, and I like something I can do. Just sort of as a sidebar, it's really not important. As I've been thinking a lot about Dr. King, I'll be retiring in 30th of June. And in August, late August of this year, be the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, the Great March on Washington, which culminated with at the Lincoln Memorial with Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And I think about that a lot, because I want to go to, if they're going to have a 50th sort of reenactment or something, I want to go to that, because I was in the original march. My father and I marched down Constitution Avenue 50 years ago. I was home on leave from the Air Force, and he was a minister in New Jersey, had gotten several buses together, and we all went. My father and I, in our family, only he and I went, and it was a great experience to experience that with him. You know, he's no longer around, of course, and to experience those extraordinary words, and just the feeling of being one of 100 or 200,000 people sort of marching for the same beliefs and for the same ideals. It was a wonderful experience I'll never forget. So I'm hoping they're going to have something like a reenactment. I want to go back and do it, maybe see how many old doddering geezers like me can still walk down Constitution Avenue. My foot's okay. I'll walk down Constitution, believe me. Anyway, read in Euthyphro. Euthyphro starts on page 1. I'd say read the first 4 pages. We'll spend a fair amount of time on those first 4 pages. So have a great weekend. See you on Wednesday. Yeah. Is that a question or? Okay. Quick, everybody get out.